Tensions explode when Taehyung's mother accuses Jungkook of a dark secret. Then Jimin speaks, and the truth leaves everyone in tears. "You murderer!" The scream tore through the hall like shattered glass, raw, jagged, unforgettable. Jungkook froze mid-step, the porcelain teacup in his hand trembling violently before crashing to the polished wooden floor. His wide eyes met hers, Taehyung's mother, whose trembling finger pointed at him like a loaded weapon. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The once elegant dinner, meant to celebrate Taehyung's return from abroad, transformed instantly into a stage of devastation. Everything went quiet. Eerily quiet, except for the sound of the chandelier's gentle sway and Jungkook's ragged breathing. Taehyung stood motionless at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, a tight grip on his wineglass. Jimin was the first to react, rising from his seat with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes flickering between Jungkook's crumbling expression and the woman whose accusation had ripped the air in two. "I didn't," Jungkook whispered, voice hollow. "I didn't kill him." Taehyung's mother stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply across the marble. "Then why were you the last person with my husband before he was found dead? Why did he whisper your name with his last breath?" Jungkook collapsed to his knees, as if gravity had suddenly become too cruel to fight. His chest heaved, his hands dug into the fabric of the tablecloth as if to keep himself from dissolving completely. There was no defiance in his face, only grief and guilt. No one moved. Outside, the autumn wind howled, carrying with it the smell of burning leaves and rain-soaked earth. The mansion's stained glass windows trembled against the sudden pressure of the storm. Taehyung's face remained unreadable, but his eyes held a storm of their own. He glanced at Jungkook and then at his mother, lips slightly parted but no words coming. Jimin, however, moved closer, kneeling beside Jungkook. His hand gently touched his back, grounding him. "Stop," Jimin said quietly, but with steel in his voice. His tone trembled, not with fear, but with a pain that was long buried and now clawing its way back to the surface. "You don't know the whole story," he said, eyes dark and wet. "None of you do, but I do." He looked up, straight at Taehyung. Taehyung's glass slipped from his hand and shattered, red wine bleeding across the floor like spilled blood. The room tilted, everything shifted. Before anyone could speak, Jungkook broke into sobs, not the quiet, restrained tears of shame, but the agonizing collapse of someone who'd carried a secret far too long. In that moment, the shadows that lingered behind their fame, their brotherhood, and their perfectly curated lives cracked wide open. None of them would be the same after that night. And the truth? It was far more twisted than any of them dared imagine. The silence that followed Jimin's confession was suffocating. Rain began to lash against the windows, rhythmic and furious, as though the world outside had decided to echo the chaos within. Jungkook, still on his knees, was trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of a memory he could no longer outrun. "You were there?" Taehyung's voice was barely above a whisper, yet it sliced through the room like a scalpel. Jimin stood slowly, his hands clenched at his sides. He didn't flinch under the weight of Taehyung's stare. "Yes, the night your father died, I was with Jungkook." Taehyung's mother recoiled as if slapped, her face contorting with fury and disbelief. "How dare you? How dare you keep that from us all these years?" "Because it wasn't what you think. None of it was." He turned to Jungkook, and for a moment, the air seemed to freeze. Jungkook's eyes met Jimin's, pleading, terrified, aching with gratitude and regret. "You told me to leave. I told you I'd handle it. And I couldn't just watch him destroy you." The room held its breath. Taehyung's hand twitched by his side. "Start talking." And so, Jimin did. The night of the fire was a blur of heat and screams. Jungkook had arrived at the Kim estate long past midnight, summoned by a desperate text from Taehyung's father. "Come alone. Don't tell anyone. It's about Taehyung." Jungkook had obeyed, heart pounding, confused and afraid. He had found the man in the library, reeking of whiskey, a half-burnt letter in the fireplace, and fury burning in his eyes. "You're poison. You and that thing you have with my son. You think I don't know? You think I'll let you drag this family into filth?" Jungkook had tried to explain, to calm him, to remind him that it was Taehyung's life to live, but the man's anger was volcanic. He'd lunged. There was a struggle. A vase shattered. Jimin had arrived moments later, uninvited, unexpected, but somehow knowing Jungkook would need him. By the time the fire started, chaos had already taken root. But what none of them had known was that the fire wasn't an accident. It was a choice. Taehyung's father had lit the flame himself, a dramatic display, a warning, perhaps a suicide masked as martyrdom. But then the smoke had filled the room faster than expected. Flames curled up the walls. Jungkook had tried to drag him out, coughing and blinded, but the old man refused. He had said, "If you love him, then leave. Let this be the end." And he had. With Jimin dragging him from the smoke, he had stumbled into the garden as the roof began to cave in. He had never told anyone what really happened, because the truth would destroy Taehyung. Not just the truth about the fire, but the truth about why his father hated Jungkook so much. The room had become a graveyard of words. Taehyung looked as if the air had been stolen from his lungs. His mother stood frozen, horror and doubt warring in her eyes. "You're lying. This is all just a lie to cover his guilt." Jimin's expression was stone. "No, we both tried to save him, but he didn't want to be saved." Then, for the first time since that terrible night, Jungkook stood. His legs shook beneath him, but he raised his eyes and met Taehyung's gaze. "I never wanted to keep this from you, but your father, he didn't just hate me. He hated what you loved. He hated you." The words hit harder than any slap. Taehyung looked as if the air had been stolen from his lungs. His mother stood frozen, horror and doubt warring in her eyes. "You're lying. This is all just a lie to cover his guilt." Jimin's expression was stone. "No, we both tried to save him, but he didn't want to be saved." Then, for the first time since that terrible night, Jungkook stood. His legs shook beneath him, but he raised his eyes and met Taehyung's gaze. "I never wanted to keep this from you, but your father, he didn't just hate me. He hated what you loved. He hated you." Then came the sound of footsteps, measured, deliberate, approaching from the dark hallway beyond the dining room. A figure stepped into view, wet from the rain, pale from travel. It was Yoongi, and his eyes told them all one thing. The story wasn't over yet, not even close. The room turned to ice as Yoongi stepped into the glow of the chandelier, rain dripping from his coat like forgotten time. His eyes scanned the wreckage, shattered glass, spilled wine, the hollow aftermath of truths spoken too late. "Yoongi?" Taehyung asked, his voice fraying. "You Knew? Yoongi's silence was its own kind of confession. I knew, but not everything. Not until now. Jungkook's hands curled into fists at his sides. Then say it! Say what you've kept buried! Yoongi exhaled, stepped forward. Fire wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. What no one had ever known, what had never made the police report, nor the headlines that followed the mysterious fire in the Kim estate, was that the fire had been covered up. Not just by the family, but by someone with power, someone who wanted silence more than justice. Taehyung's father had debts, deep, dangerous ones, and secrets that went further than disapproval of his son's love. Blackmail, threats, a life built on controlling everyone, even those he loved. Yoongi had discovered it slowly, through files buried in old contracts, anonymous letters delivered in the dead of night, whispers from people too afraid to speak aloud. At first he hadn't known what it meant. Then he found the tape. That night, while the house was still burning, a security camera, installed without the family's knowledge, had recorded something that no one was ever meant to see. Not the fire, not the argument, but what happened after. Yoongi pulled a flash drive from his coat pocket, held it out like a loaded gun. I wasn't sure you were ready to see this, but you deserve to know who your father really was. Jimin stepped forward. Yoongi? Are you sure? Yoongi nodded. I should have shown you this a year ago. I was afraid. But fear is a liar. It doesn't protect. It rots. Taehyung took the flash drive with shaking hands. For a moment he just stared at it, this small thing that might carry the final ghost of his father. They watched together as the footage played on the laptop Yoongi brought in from the hallway. No one breathed. The screen flickered. At first, just smoke, shouting. Jungkook's voice broken, the shape of the fire in the windows. Then, faintly, the sound of another voice, Jimin's, panicked, begging him to get out. And then, silence. A long, agonizing silence. But it wasn't over. Taehyung's father, burned and coughing, staggered toward the fireplace. In a final act of control, he reached beneath the mantel and pressed something, hidden. A panel slid open in the wall. Behind it, cash, a ledger, a sealed envelope with Taehyung's name on it. He stared at the camera, dead in the eyes. I hope you never find this, son. Because if you do, it means I've failed. The screen went black. Taehyung didn't cry. He just closed the laptop and sat in silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was a whisper. No anger, no rage, only a fragile grief that came from the soul. He didn't hate Jungkook. He hated himself. Jungkook approached, unsure, still shaking. I would have told you, but I thought the truth would break you. Taehyung looked up, and for the first time in what felt like years, he smiled. Softly, painfully. It didn't break me. It brought me back.
He reached out, and Jungkook took his hand. Taehyung's mother sat down heavily, her fury drained, replaced with a distant mourning. I blamed you, because it was easier than facing the truth. Jungkook bowed his head, lips trembling. I understand. But she stood and walked to him, and in a gesture that no one expected, she placed a hand on his cheek, gentle. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Outside, the storm had passed. The sky was still gray, but the rain had stopped. The windows no longer shook. Only the sound of breath, of hearts beginning to mend. Jimin walked out onto the terrace alone, the wind stirring his hair. Yoongi followed after a moment, joining him in silence. Do you think they'll be okay? Jimin asked. Yoongi got a half smile. Eventually, truth breaks you before it frees you. And us? Yoongi gave a half smile. We already broke, and we survived. In the final hour of dusk, Jungkook and Taehyung stood by the window, hands intertwined, watching as the clouds parted just enough for light to bleed through. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. What had once been burned in secret now stood open in the air between them, raw, painful, but true. And in truth, they found something not even love could give alone. Peace.